All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to mute all of your, what are they called? Speakers, just so you know. And I'll see if people join. Okay, team, you ready? I should, let me pull up the chat. If you have questions, you can always put them in the chat. It will depend on if we have time, if I can get to them, but I want to make sure that you know that that's there. And I will have my chat open here so that I can see what's going on. But let's get started, everybody. Hi, happy Tuesday. Welcome to Love and Open Relationships. Thank you for joining me. I have a number of folks who are new to me who are actually recommended for this, so I want to make sure to give you a good update of who I am. But first, let me pull up my notes. Cool. All right, here we go. So for those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar with me, if you haven't been following me for very long, or if you aren't on my mailing list or any of those things, hello, I'm Dr. Stephanie Webb. My doctorate is in communication. My specialty is in critical interpersonal and family relationships, and my research has been primarily on romantic relationships of all different kinds. I've studied monogamy, I've studied non-monogamy, I've studied identities in polyamory, which is a subset of non-monogamy, right? I've studied lesbian co-mothering relationships. I've studied all different kinds of things across the board over my duration of research. And so when I speak from my teaching platform, if you will, I speak both from that academic lens, I'll pull in research, I'll talk about things like that, but I also definitely speak from experience as well, because I've identified as polyamorous for about the last 12 years. It's actually varied over those years. I've dabbled in calling myself a relationship anarchist. I've had bouts of like performing monogamy within that. At this point in time in my life, it's not so much about how I identify, it's more about how I can explain what my situation is so that it makes sense to other people. The way in which I teach very much comes from a platform or a philosophy that I believe that there is no specific type of relationship that is right for everybody. And even if you decide to do something like an open relationship, there's so many different ways to do swinging, to do polyamory, to do relationship anarchy, that there really is a high communication component that needs to come down to it. So that's sort of where I approach my teaching and my education. So what do? I am an educator and a coach. I've taught all different kinds of things over my academic career, from public speaking to advanced interpersonal relationships, but I also teach in this platform, in the platform that you're engaging with me now. I very much love teaching. It's one of my favorite things. And so when it comes down to it, teaching is something that I extend beyond a formal classroom and into what I do every day. When I coach clients, I very much teach, I advise, I give my own personal experience in addition to academic experience. So that's me. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay, let me type this in here. I have a few people who are saying that they can't hear. So click join audio at the bottom. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk a little bit about love in open relationships and why it's important. So what is an open relationship to begin? I define open relationships as the umbrella term for any kind of consensual non-monogamy. Okay, what do I mean by consensual non-monogamy? That people know that you are engaging in non-monogamous behavior. I do not think of cheating as being in an open relationship, because cheating implies that someone doesn't know something. So when it comes down to it, that does not fall under the umbrella of open relationships. I don't want to get too much into detail about that, but that's something that's really important when I discuss what I mean in love and open relationships. Why talk about love now? So there is something that's called compulsory monogamy. Compulsory monogamy is the idea that monogamy is the right and only way to be in a romantic relationship. And as a result of that, many people believe that monogamy is the status quo or the standard for operating in romantic relationships. I'll give you an example of compulsory monogamy. When I walk into rooms of undergraduates to teach, I often tell them that I don't identify as polyamorous, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the first questions I almost always get is, when did you decide to be polyamorous? In asking that question, they're implying that monogamy is the status quo and that at some point in time I had to decide to be different from it. Therein, that is compulsory monogamy. Compulsory monogamy has set us up to understand love through the lens of monogamy. And you can see this in different cultural scripts that we have around being the one. That our loved one is supposed to, and I say that specifically, our loved one is supposed to meet all of our needs and desires, that we fall in romantic love and it should only be with one person. There's even a really loosely destructive meme that's out there that says that if you love two people simultaneously, that means that you don't love either of them and that you should break up with them both. And that's fucking nonsense. That is the lens of compulsory monogamy that I discuss. As I mentioned before, I've actually researched monogamy, and I researched how people understand monogamy now. And there is a term that's out there that's called mononormativity. Mononormativity is the normalization of monogamy. It's very similar to the construct or concept of compulsory monogamy. It's actually rooted in Gus Diep's work that talked about heteronormativity, but they sort of advanced it away from heterosexual relationships into also relationship paradigms. And so when it comes down to it, when I did my research, I was looking at how people perceive monogamy when they interact with it or when they choose to do it. And my research showed that there are some people who really do lean into this expectation of mononormativity, which is the idea that there is a soulmate, that there is the one, all those things that I just mentioned. But then there's also folks who approach it from, I called it a monorealistic perspective. And the monorealistic perspective are the people who say, I'm in a monogamous relationship, but yada, yada, yada. I understand that monogamy doesn't mean that my partner's going to fulfill all of my wants, needs, and desires, those kinds of things. They're the people who might be in monogamous relationships, but they have a sort of realistic perspective of what they mean and look like. And when it comes down to it, this sort of fissure that happens in monogamy allows us to open up our understanding that doing relationships can change or is different for every person, rather. So every person might have a different perspective, but it can also change over time. Okay. So you might gravitate towards being in open relationships and then not being in open relationships over time. And all of this is okay. Okay. So setting that up. I really want to talk back to this idea, and we'll talk a little bit more in the future, that if you love two people simultaneously, it means you don't really love anyone at all. That's something that I get a lot of feedback from, even from folks who are in open relationships. They feel like if their partner loves someone else, that means that they will not be valued the same way. And that's something we're going to talk a little bit more about today. The other thing that's really important is just to understand that the construct that we have created that surrounds romantic love, that is rooted in our understanding of monogamy, is also inextricably linked to the institution of marriage. And so there are larger cultural constructs at play that influence the way we do our relationships, because it's tied to economics, because it's tied to government structures, because it's tied to the way in which we create our communities. It's tied to family. And so this idea of love and open relationships is much bigger than the simple nugget. Sorry, here's Tonks. If you haven't seen Tonks before, this is my cat. She's a little chatty today. But when it comes down to it, it's bigger than just what's happening in our own insular world. When we decide to disrupt systems of love that transcend to systems like marriage, we are in fact making political statements about ourselves and the world around us. Now, whether or not we do this publicly and say it out loud, interpersonal shifts are ultimately what cause cultural shifts. So that's another reason why it's really important to have this sort of talk, a deeper understanding of what love means, how we were trained to see love, and how we have the capacity of growth for love in the future. Okay. Let's move on. I think everyone's in. I hope everyone can hear things now. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so a big thing about love in open relationships that oftentimes people come in conflict with, and this is across the board, this is from people who are learning about monogamy or non-monogamy for the first time, all the way through people who have been in non-monogamous relationships for 20 to 30 years, is that our construct or concepts of love are often intertwined with ideas of morality. Now, this can be on a big scale. Some people attach love to their idea of religion, right? And so they take it to the spiritual sort of space where they say that their spiritual writings and the work that they do in their religious communities is tied to a specific kind of loving. And as a result of that, that specific kind of loving is better than any other kind of love, right? We see this a lot in Christian work about what love looks like, about why monogamy is so upheld in the Christian church. If you look at the Bible and scripture, though, there's lots of arguments against that. So that's something just to take into consideration. The next step to that is our cultural understanding of morality. And this is more of what I understand people get in conflict with over time, or what they come to me to talk about, is another way to say that, are when we see love as it's positioned as better in relationships than other relationships types. And this is really prevalent in the polyamorous community. I argue that it's prevalent in the polyamorous community because polyamory has the word love in it specifically, right? It's multiple loves with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. And as a result of that, lots of people take this construct, this idea that I love my partners. I want to love my partners. Therefore, my openness is somehow better than yours. That's a moral stance. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these folks are right or wrong. If they believe that, great. It might be grounded in a religious background. It might be grounded in other things. However, when it comes to the way that I speak about this, it's not going to serve us today. And I might offend you, and cool, I'm here for that. But when it comes down to it, calling a relationship better out of love actually supports that idea of mononormativity. It supports the idea of compulsory monogamy, because you're not actually critically thinking about why is love more important, and why do I think love is more important than sex in a relationship, all those kinds of things. And then the final piece of this is just more of an explanation of that, is I very often have folks who come to me and they say, I'm polyamorous, my partner is defined as polyamorous, but my partner has found a partner that they just want to have sex with. They don't want to romantically engage with. And I take issue with that. I struggle with the fact that they just want to have a sexual relationship, because I think that my way of doing this, that I want to connect with my partners, is a better way. My partner gets to meet my other partners, for example. There are implications that come with love in open relationships that don't come with having multiple sexual partners in open relationships. And I've had people who identify as relationship anarchists say this to me too, that love is something that they don't want to define in their relationships, that it feels different, but they want to have love when it comes down to their long-term relationships. And I will not moralize over their stance, but I'm just trying to point out how fucking complicated this all is, right? The way we understand love has become something that is such a part of our story that it can be hard to see how we wield it. And the best ways that we can sort of approach deconstructing this, I am about to talk about. So let me see. Let me make sure if I said everything in my notes here. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Am I making sense? I see one person is typing something, so I might wait just a second. No, they stopped typing. Okay, cool. I'll keep moving on. So we just discussed this idea that love comes from culture, right? It comes from religion, it comes from family, it comes from the ways in which we expect relationships to look as we move forward. And even when we start deconstructing the compulsory monogamy perspective that we've seen, when we open it up to open relationships, love can mean lots of different things. Love can have a different impact on all of us. And it comes down to the work that we do on how we define this. And this is the empowering part. This is the exciting part of this sort of talk. It's thinking about what love means to you in a thoughtful, ongoing way. This is not a project that you just get to do today and be like, I'm done. I've decided for myself what love means, and I get to move on forever with this being my big T capital truth, right? When it comes to love and open relationships, the first thing you need to take into consideration is, how do you define love? We have, just in the definition, you might describe it as a physical sensation. Lots of people describe love as a physical sensation, and that makes a lot of sense. We do have physiological responses to love. And if you look at research about bodies on love, it's actually very much like you feel a lot of anxiety. There's lots of hormones that drop. There's lots of concerns. There's lots of worries. Arguably, some people say that it looks like, if you're looking at the brain on love, it looks like a really negative experience because there's so much shit going on, right? But when it comes down to it, that does create certain physiological experiences. And if we get spurned in love, or if we're hurting in love, we actually have withdrawal. Heartbreak is a real thing. It does emotionally break us. And so there is physical sensations that come along with it. But then, how do you intellectualize your love? How do you define it when it comes to its larger meaning in your body? And the reason why this is important is because we've conflated love to be more than just an emotional experience. What is my proof of saying that? If you meet someone for the first time and they say, I'm wildly in love with you, that oftentimes makes people freak out a little bit, because we conflate love with ideas of long-term relationships, which means that we conflate it with commitment. Oftentimes when we say, I love you, there is an underlying silent expectation for commitment. I did research on this in 2015, and it was something that was consistent across the board, that many people say that when they say they're in love with someone, they hope or expect or anticipate a type of commitment. Okay? The other thing that people might arguably anticipate, and this is due to the relationship escalator, which I'll talk about here in just a second, is oftentimes love is the first step towards like marriage, right? And so when we think about love along that relationship escalator, if you're unfamiliar with the relationship escalator is the idea that a relationship becomes more committed over time, and that there are certain steps for that sort of elevation of the relationship. Usually it's dating, there's a vocalized commitment, there's falling in love, there's getting married, there's moving in together, there's having babies, there's like planning retirement together. Like, those are sort of the steps on the relationship escalator. Okay. That's very much out there. There's a woman who actually creates a whole bunch of research just based on that, and she does some brilliant work. So when we think about love and the relationship escalator, the thing that's also interesting about that is a lot of those steps are actually part of the psychological process of adulthood too. When you look at like what adulthood is, some of it, like steps of the relationship escalator, are actually included on that. So we've conflated our romantic relationships as an integral component of being an adult, whatever that means. But that's why this idea that love is the root, the base of a lot of this stuff in our culture today, specifically, it means a lot. I ranted the other day on Instagram about how love wasn't always the foundation of monogamy. If you're interested, or marriage rather, if you're interested in learning more, there's a woman named Stephanie Kuntz who wrote a book called Marriage: A History. And she talks about how love wasn't actually a part of the marital structure for a very long time. It was more about family relationships. It was more about wealth. It was more of a useful tool for people to move forward politically rather than having it be something where people were expected to fall in love and carry out their relationship based on a loving experience. Okay. I just got a note. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. All different kinds of love. 100% different in romantic relationships, different for I should read the comment. Michelle says, love is so different for everyone in your life, everything. No love is the same. Even mothers loving their child. Each child has a different love felt by their mom and dad. Yeah, exactly. If you're willing to admit that to yourself. So this first step that I'm talking about is the definition of love. We talked about it physiologically, the emotional definitions, and now what does it actually mean to you? And here's a little thing that I've told folks to do over time, and I'll probably post it on Instagram too, so you'll see it as a reminder again, is when you go to tell someone you love them, take a moment to think about what you mean in that moment. Okay? What does it mean when you say goodbye to someone, kiss them, and leave? It might feel very different if you live with them and you're kissing them goodbye and you're going to be back in 8 hours because you went to work, versus kissing someone goodbye who is flying across the world and you don't know if you'll ever see them again. Right? Can you viscerally sit in those two places, even if it's the same person? What if it's the same person? Love will feel different. Love, when you're telling it to someone for the first time, what does that mean versus when you say it to someone on the phone every time you get off the phone with them? What does it mean when you're having sex with someone versus if you are at an anniversary dinner, right? Think about when you want to utter those words to someone you love, what are you actually trying to communicate to them in that moment? This is a powerful tool in understanding how we can experience nuances of emotions and call it the same thing over and over and over again. Because in each of those instances, I don't know about you, but I define love differently for all of those. I'm communicating different things in all of those. I'm physiologically feeling it differently in all of those. And if I take it for one person and I bring in my other partner, so say all of that with Ryan is very different than all of that with Jeremy for me. And this is a powerful exercise in understanding how you, over time, create different definitions of love, but you expect your partner to know based on context. What happens if you say, instead of just, I love you, bye, you take a few days to say, I love you, and by that I mean, ... I look forward to seeing you tonight, right? I love you, and I mean I'm stupid turned on right now. I love you, and I mean that I want to be with you for multiple anniversaries to come, right? You can have all kinds of different definitions of what that means, okay? Another way of doing this, especially of just sort of shifting the way in which we understand love for ourselves, is taking the time to understand how monogamy has influenced and continues to influence your understanding of love. And I say this very critically and very clearly because I have lots of folks who I work with who are like, oh, monogamy doesn't influence me at all anymore. Nope, just doesn't. And then as I talk with them, I can see like 7 different ways monogamy is influencing them. They want to live with only one partner. They want to have babies with only one partner. It takes them a really long time to say they love you to other people because they want to make sure that other person is going to be around for long enough so it's worth it. These are all influenced by monogamy. It doesn't mean that you are like behaving, But it does mean that it is very hard to tease out the influence of monogamy when it is the water in which we swim every day. It is the air that we breathe. It is everything that we have understood and that we see culturally on how to perform relationships. Okay? And so when it comes down to it, having an ongoing conversation with yourself, and don't moralize about it, right? You're not right or wrong. You're not doing polyamory wrong if you want to live with one partner. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. It's just trying to understand how external influences make the way you experience love different. Okay, so maybe have a journal or an ongoing journal process, maybe every month on the 3rd. I don't know why I arbitrarily picked the 3rd, but that's when you decide to just critically think about how monogamy has influenced love that day. Okay, and this is something like, I'm not saying that like doing this for 12 years means that I don't have anything else to learn and that I'm never still learning. I'm always learning about myself when it comes down to this. But to this day, I still think about like how monogamy influences the way in which I claim love, and which what I expect when I say I love someone, if I do expect something, even the way in which I understand and conceptualize unconditional love. All of these are steeped in an understanding of monogamous behavior. So having an ongoing critical thought process with myself is a big part of that. I have in my notes here, don't get cocky. Even people who practice open relationships still oftentimes hold on to ideas of compulsory monogamy. That made me laugh, so I thought I'd share it with you. Okay. Another way to think about this stuff is like seeking out someone who can poke holes in your ideas of love. I know that that's a weird way to frame it, but I do have some folks who I work with, who I coach, who like our goal is for them to just sit with me and have me think through the way in which they structure their relationships, because they do have really, a lot of them have negative opinions of monogamy. And so they're trying to do something that's fundamentally different. And those negative opinions might come from the relationships that they've seen around them, like their parents, or it might come from they had really bad experiences themselves in monogamous relationships. And so as they move forward, they want to understand how monogamy has influenced their understandings of love and relationships. And so I essentially critically think with them. People go to therapy for this shit all the time too. Therapists are another really good resource. I'm not a therapist. Okay. And here is sort of one of the final questions that you can ask yourself is, how do you value love? Okay. And this can get into some of that moralizing thing where like you think that being in romantic love with a partner means that that kind of relationship is inherently more valuable than companionate kind of love where there's not necessarily passion anymore, right? As you move through a long-term relationship and love shifts and changes over time, and you might not have as deep of a sexual connection, for example, does that mean that that love is less valuable because there's not necessarily sex involved? Does love imply that sex needs to be involved in a romantic context, right? Of course, we have other kinds of relationships where sex isn't even on the table, but for folks who experience this kind of stuff and who want to think critically about it, what are some of the other things that you attach to the value of love that influence how you say it, when you say it, what you mean when you say it, what you expect when you say it, those kinds of things? Does that make good sense? Do you have any questions? I need to take a drink of water. I hope you're all doing okay. Thanks for sticking around with me. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about, culture. We've talked about the definitions of love, and we've talked about what you can do as someone who is working on themselves in this idea of love. And you can do this if you're in a monogamous relationship or not. I see you folks out there who are my monogamous people who are like, what can I learn from people in open relationships? I love you, but you can also do this work too, right? Having an ongoing, just critical thought process about what love means to you is a brilliant work, regardless of your relationship type. Okay. So, however, this next part, specifically for my folks who are venturing into open relationships or maybe in them, I get lots of questions about How do I deal with people who challenge my love for my partners? It's fucking frustrating to talk to someone about being in an open relationship. And some of the big challenges that people get are like, oh, well, that means you don't really love your partner because you have multiple, right? Or, I could never do that because I could never love multiple people simultaneously. It would mean that I wasn't in love at all. All those kinds of really uncomfortable rejections we get from people when we tell them we love multiple people simultaneously. How the shit do you deal with that kind of stuff? The first question I always ask myself is it worth your while? Right? Do you have the emotional bandwidth to deal with that at that point in time? Are you invested in that person understanding, or are you just letting them grind your gears? Right? Like if you're at a bar and you're talking about being in an open relationship and some drunk jerk face comes up and tells you that your love isn't valid, does it fucking matter what they think? Depends on if you're being a drunk jerk face too, right? Like you really might want to rally and have that conversation, but most of the time it's not the most wildly beneficial thing to do. Okay. What are some other things about what makes it worth your while? I can't think of any off the top of my head. Those were my two. So I'll move forward. When I first started openly coming out about being non-monogamous, this was probably about 10 years ago. It probably took me about 2 years to step into it and start talking about it in an open way. I very much was the kind of person who wanted to change everyone's mind about love because I was in love with two people at that point. I was in love with Ryan and I was in love with Phil. I was deeply in love with both of them. And anyone who told me that my love was not valid, I got personally affronted. And what wound up happening was over time, I think I needed to burn that out. I needed to have those conversations. I needed to feel that frustration and I needed to hear it because everything that they said about love that were challenges to me were oftentimes things that I had believed at one point in time too. I grew up in a good Catholic household. And so it was understood that I was supposed to be monogamous. I should have been married by now. I'm a spinster now based in my relationship or based in my family sort of categories. And like Italian Catholic too. And so when it comes down to it, I needed to hear their challenges because so much of me still sort of believed them. I did wonder if what I was doing was useful or valuable. I did wonder if it was a phase. I did wonder if somehow I was missing what true love was. And it was in facing those things and in talking to people about it that I realized that other people's opinions were just opinions and that I likely would never be able to argue someone into understanding my perspective because they couldn't step into my body and feel what I was feeling. And that ultimately, if I felt those challenges in and of myself, that was where I had to work. And so I rarely actually experience those conversations anymore. And I think it was because I took a lot of time to learn about myself in that process and to understand when to engage, when not to engage, and what it meant if I decided to. Oftentimes it would just tap my energy. I would get really angry and I would go to bat and I would end up feeling pretty good about my arguments because I'm really good at arguing. And then I would leave and I'd need to like sleep for 2 days because I just had burned so much energy on being angry and constructing arguments. And so it just wasn't worth it over time. And so one way to invite you into this conversation is when people are challenging you, if it is triggering something in you, if it's giving you that little sort of zing, ask yourself, do I question it this way myself? It doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean your love is bad. It just means you have a little bit of work to think about there. How do you create ease? How do you stop inviting that reflection back at you while you do the work on yourself? You don't argue with other people because arguing with other people can be sort of a type of intellectual masturbation, right? Where you just keep going after it, but there's no self-work that's actually done. You just keep arguing for the sake of arguing. So this kind of leads into the second point, that understanding that some people will never actually engage in a conversation that might allow their opinion to change is another big one here, right? Sometimes if we're just arguing for the sake of arguing, neither of us are willing to actually hear. We might be listening. We might let our this person we're talking to talk for a minute, but it doesn't mean we're actually taking in that information and letting it influence us. Instead, what we're doing is while they're talking, we're formulating our rebuttal. That's not hearing, that's listening. Listening is like the physiological skill of hearing something. Hearing is the actual act of taking that information in and having it mean something. And sometimes we don't want to hear it, sometimes they don't want to hear it, and then you just argue, okay? So here's the last sort of leg of this that's arguably the most challenging. And this is the idea of practicing some compassion during these challenges. What did they get out of maintaining their opinion of love that's different from yours? This can vary from person to person, right? And if you're able to sort of sit there and say, like, maybe it's part of their own limitations of understanding of love, and that's fine. It's not up to you to change their limitations. It might be a protection mechanism for their own relationships or how they've experienced love. It might be the moral high ground for how they see it. They might just think they're right. You think you're right too. Doesn't mean anyone's wrong, but how do you practice compassion? And these are the moments where they're hard, especially if someone is really like, especially if you're really invested in changing their mind, like it's a family member or a parent, or a best friend, right? And you really want them to understand that your capacity for love is more than the way in which they see it. So you might be highly invested in them changing their mind, but they might have a damn good reason for why they believe what they believe, and it's not up to you to change it. Finally, remember that if people then formulate an opinion about your love, we gotta love that, right? Oh, you love multiple people simultaneously? That means you're not in love at all. You're a hussy. Um, I don't know if anyone ever actually called me a hussy. They called me other very, very mean things. But we need to remember that those opinions that they then form are not, in fact, based on you, right? It's a reflection of their own understandings of love and their own limitations. Notice that most of this work is flipping it back on yourself, understanding why you're reacting how you're reacting, understand why defensiveness about love is a thing that happens a lot, and what can you learn from that. You should also know that one of my philosophies is most of our conflicts are moments that we can take to learn about ourselves and to grow. They are the friction that creates alchemy that allows for growth. And you can either wait for life to present friction for you, or you can kind of go out and create your own and hasten that growth process. It's not for everybody. But for lots of the folks that I work with, they tend to want relational friction faster so that they can grow faster. But the unfortunate thing there is it doesn't mean that there's like a given amount of friction that you experience in your life. Your entire life, you'll continue to experience friction. So if you get at it faster, you just might need to keep doing it and keep seeking it out more. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Okay, that's sort of the end of my lecture portion. If you have questions, please type them in. I do, however, have a number of questions that came through that I would like to address, and I'm going to address them as quickly as I can. You can kind of tell I'm a little verbose, but I will go ahead and get through them. Um, I like that. The friction and growth is what allows me to understand and love myself. Hmm, I like that. Um, yeah, it's definitely friction is what allows us to learn about ourselves constantly. Okay, so I there's a number of questions here, and I'll just go ahead and read them. Three primary though. So, question one: I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about descriptive hierarchy and how to find security in relationships when you've become everyone's secondary partner, even if that's not the intent or language used around it. Okay, so let's take a moment to define some terms. What the heck is descriptive polyamory? I'm pulling my definitions here from the Polyland blog. I really like the Polyland blog. If you've never looked at it, check it out. It's a good resource. If you're in my newsletter and you get the syllabus, you've seen Polyland before. But descriptive If a hierarchy is a descriptive hierarchy, terms like primary and secondary are used to describe the current level of entanglement in a relationship. It's understandable that a partner of many years that you live and share finances with is going to have a different sort of dynamic than a brand new partner you've only begun to date casually. In a descriptive hierarchy, when you call your pre-existing nesting partner primary and your new flame secondary, you're not saying anything about what they can become to you in the future, only what they are now. So descriptive is the idea that in the current moment, you're simply describing the relationships around you rather than providing them with a limitation of where it can grow to. Okay. That's conversed, or the flip side of that coin is our prescriptive hierarchy, which is the opposite of that. The terms primary and secondary not only describe the current relationships, but also serve as an indicator of what those relationships will be in the future. Okay. They are they actually cap what other relationships can become. The primary is the primary, and that is the intention, and the secondaries stay secondaries. Folks in prescriptive hierarchies often say things like, I love you dearly, but my marriage comes first and always will. Okay, so those are the definitions between the two. So the question that was asked again is, what about descriptive hierarchy and how to find security in relationships when you've become everyone's secondary partner, even though that's not the description that you or the language used around it. And when it comes down to it, to me, in this question, there's a key word that's being used, which is security. And oftentimes the word security is meant to change our understanding with uncertainty. Security, in essence, limits our uncertainty by giving us an expectation of the future. And so when it comes down to it, the one way that you can approach this, it's a very practical way, is by seeing, identifying, doing the self work to identify what it is that you need and want in your relationships, talking to your partners about it, and seeing if you can get that agreement, right? I've been a secondary partner a number of times, actually in prescriptive hierarchy, meaning I knew that I would always be secondary. And when it came down to it, that relationship felt very secure to me, because of the agreements that we had had going into it. I knew that I would see them a certain amount of times a month. I knew that I would talk to them on the phone a certain amount of times a month. Of course, if anything happened or changed, like, they're human, shit happens. Sometimes you have to reschedule, right? Sometimes those expectations aren't met, but ongoingly were they? Yes, it was fine. That gave me security. That didn't stop the relationship from crashing and burning. But even in like primary, where my marriage will always come first, like, that relationship always has the potential to crash and burn too. And like, God forbid, mortality, right? Like, your primacy could end because the worst thing happens, which is they are no longer in this realm. Shit got dark there. But when it comes down to it, we cannot guarantee ourselves security. So step one would be identify the things that you want that give you security. Ask for it. Structure your relationship in a way where you feel like you get it. The second way is doing the deeper work of understanding that security is a false construct that we actually never can uphold. And this is sort of a Buddhist perspective, right? Like, nothing is permanent. And if you do that deeper work, you have more of an understanding of ebbing and flowing, of loving people through their different limitations. It just sort of depends on where you want to do that work. It oftentimes feels a lot better to try to limit our uncertainty, to give ourselves the false understanding that we have control over anything. I'm getting real philosophical on y'all asses now. But it's real, right? Well, is it? I'm not going to go Twilight Zone, I promise. Moving on to the next question. The future doesn't exist. Yeah, no, sure doesn't. Only right now does. Okay. So, any tips for someone who is single trying to navigate through open relationships? It seems easier and harder as I don't have someone to go home to and debrief with how my night went. I loved this question, and it's partially just because of where I come from in open relationships. As I've said, I've defined as a relationship anarchist in the past. I've described myself as polyamorous. I've just called myself in open relationships, the one that seems to stick and the most people sort of identify me as, and that I can kind of come to the fore with, is being solo poly. And I identify as solo poly. For me, that means that I focus on my relationship with myself, that I don't intend to have a nesting partner or like financial entanglements with people. That for me, it's very much about my relationships operating as a function of how healthy I can operate myself. But then Ryan and I moved in together, and most of that went to shit because I realized how much of solo poly I defined as nesting together. Holy shit. I'm always doing work myself. But at any rate, this assumption that having a partner to come home to and debrief with first, I don't know, kind of has a little bit of a monogamous quality to it. It implies that most open people in open relationships have a partner who they live with that they do debrief with. The other thing that it implies is that people debrief with their partners about their other relationships. Neither of these are fundamentally true. Okay. Um, Sure, it might be nice to have someone you can talk to about it. But again, that's what educators, therapists, best friends are for, right? And so when it comes down to it, the first thing I just want to say is in that second sentence, you don't need to debrief with a partner. And some partners don't want you to debrief with them at all. There's boundaries that come there, right? And so that expectation doesn't necessarily exist at large. Now, any tips from someone who is single and who's trying to navigate through? Yes, take the time to think about your boundaries. Okay, boundaries are fundamentally different than rules. Boundaries are things you impose for yourself, rules are things you impose to control someone else's behavior. Okay, so boundaries for myself would be I am going to maintain one night a week where I don't do anything. I introvert super hard. Boundaries are I'm not texting anyone back during the day while I'm at work. Boundaries are I only use dating apps on a Saturday. Boundaries are things like I will protect the integrity of my emotions so that I'm capable of doing my work. If something happens where like my work becomes jeopardized, I need to step back from that relationship. All of these things are boundaries. If you don't know how to define your boundaries, I have an online course of it. You can go to my website. You can talk to me about it. You can Google that shit. There's some great resources that are free out there on how to develop boundaries for yourself. That's one of the best things that you can do as a single person seeking out open relationships. Yeah. Please do that work. Lots of times people don't want to do that work. They want to create boundaries once they're in a relationship because they'll have someone to like bounce the boundaries off of. Don't do that. Know what you need first. Okay. Because you're going to come in contact with multiple people simultaneously. It's going to fuck up your boundaries and it's going to be wildly problematic. Woo, I said that fast. I'll breathe. Cool. So tip 1, find your boundaries. Tip 2, do the work that I said before, which is define how you think about love, define what your values around love, define what you think you might want. Know that all of those might change over time, and that's okay. You're a growing human. But having a foundational understanding about the way these words impact you now is wildly important. Okay. All right, last question. This one's a little bit longer. Okay. Actually, I might not read the whole question, so never mind. I was wondering what your opinion is on whether two people who want to be together could ever work in an open relationship if one of the partners is traditionally monogamous and the other has wanted an open relationship but has never been in one. Can someone change their way of thinking? Whoop, I lost my space. There it is. Can someone change their way of thinking to be happy with an open partner, or is it something you have to truly want for yourself as well? Yes, you absolutely can have a monogamous and polyamorous partner work in a relationship. It's fucking hard, but let's be honest, relating at large is fucking hard, right? Any type of relationship takes work. The few things that I would say here, as they're applicable in this particular webinar or free class or whatever you want me to call it, is that you have to take responsibility for your decision. I've worked with a number of folks who say that they felt forced into seeing their partner be in an open relationship. And as a result, they held a lot of resentment for their partner because they wanted their partner to be monogamous too. Okay. So if you are the monogamous party in this duo where one person is monogamous and one person is non-monogamous, there has to be a very clear understanding that you are choosing to be in a relationship with someone who is polyamorous or in an open relationship of other kinds, rather than hoping that someday they will change their mind or wishing that that experience was different. That fundamentally lays the foundation for you to be able to move forward and work through some of the other shit. Because usually the other thing that comes to the fore is feelings of being not enough for your partner, feeling like you have some kind of, I don't want to say this, right to primacy. Because you're monogamous, you might want to require your partner to see you as a prescriptive primary, which may or may not be what they want and need in their relationship. And so it takes a lot of work in understanding each other's life views and what you want outside of that. And like also talking about like babies and nesting and living together and shit like that. Like there's some things that become fundamentally inoperable with a monogamous and a polyamorous person if the understandings don't work, right? If you want your polyamorous partner to be your primary and for you to be the person that they make decisions with and the person that they have babies with and the person who they live with and all of that kind of stuff, but they don't want that and they have other partners that they want to do that with, that's when it's like, all right, let's take a critical look at what that relationship looks like and will it actually pan out. I highly recommend that you get some kind of relational assistance when doing this to begin. And that's because folks who are entering into polyamorous relationships too, or who have been polyamorous, oftentimes need help as they move and grow too. And they might not have interacted with being with someone who is monogamous, like most of their partners maybe were polyamorous too. And so there's just a lot of work that needs to go into it. And it's super helpful to have someone who teaches, guides, therapizes. You have therapists, you have coaches, you have all kinds of people who have access that can help, right? Okay, those were the questions, and those were my truncated answers. I'm coming in just under that hour mark, which I'm pleased with. I was real scared about this one. But this leaves it open now, right? Are there any other questions that you all have about love, about your experience? I'll give you a couple minutes to poke those into the questions. But I do want to say at this point, if you have enjoyed this particular education session, fucking thank you for coming. I love doing this kind of work. I love talking to people about relationships. I love helping people in their relationships. It's something that I wish I had had when I first started this. And when it comes down to it, I do offer ongoing education in my membership that I really work to keep affordable. It's $5 a month. You get an education session every month and a question and answer session every month. In addition to, I also do a review of a polyamorous resource or a relationship resource every month. And that's available to you, like I said, for $5 a month. If you are interested in that, you'll be getting an email from me soon about it. And I would absolutely love to have you as a part of that community. My goal is to ultimately have a big enough community where you can interact and support each other and all of that kind of stuff too. But that's something that is available. Like I said, I strive to keep it affordable because it's important that all of this stuff is accessible. But ultimately, I do have to pay for these platforms where I can educate from. So that's why I do this. So when it comes down to it, if you have any questions or thoughts on those, let me know. Also, if you want to work with me in a one-on-one capacity or in small groups, you can also just shoot me an email after this and let me know. Yes, absolutely share this talk with your partner. Yes, absolutely. You'll be getting a recording of this. So if you want to share it with anyone, please do. Feel free. This is a free resource. I would love people to use it, teach with it, do whatever you need to spread this information if you find it helpful. All right, I have one question that came through. Building off that last question, though I'm in principle open to various forms of non-monogamy and enjoyed being in a relationship with someone who has all kinds of different non-monogamous relationships, I haven't been interested in pursuing any outside romantic relationships or physical relationships without my current partner. How should I handle family and friends who advise that I should be dating around and to get too attached? Ooh, that's a good question. Um, don't listen to them. That would be my advice. Try to take what they have to say with a grain of salt because that's nonsense. I have gone through bouts of only having sex with and being romantic with one partner at a time for all kinds of reasons that I don't need to justify to other people. And what is too attached? What does that even mean? Like, if you're going to feel love for someone and you're going to feel attached to someone, you're going to do that regardless of other people that you're dating. I like to think that you probably don't have people like on the back bench waiting for like that relationship to crumble so that you can scoop them up, right? Like, sorry, just dropped my phone. But when it comes down to it, ignore them. And if you struggle to ignore them, just understand that your own scope and your own capability and whatever you are willing to do in that relationship is up to you. And what other people tell you to do doesn't matter. And I know that's easier said than done, but hot damn, that also seems to me like it's coming from a monogamous paradigm, right? Like if your partner has other um, interests, it means you need to cushion yourself with other interests too. Nah, you don't need to protect yourself from uncomfortable feelings if your partner decides to do whatever they think your partner decides to do and you break up, right? Part of being a human is experiencing discomfort and being okay with it. That's what makes us invincible. Cool. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Um, it means so much to me to have you here. I'm just fucking stoked to have you here. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Always feel free. Email inbox is there, right? I'm not as good at replying to Instagram. So if you found me on Instagram, that inbox fills up pretty quick and it gets pretty overwhelming. So send me an email. You'll hear from me soon and you'll get this recording probably in the next hour. It usually takes about an hour for my computer to load it. Cool. All right, y'all. I hope you have a happy frickin' Tuesday, and I will see you, I don't know, sometime soon. All right. Bye, y'all.